Before any sewing project, I like to make my students do this worksheet because we need to practice a few basic stitches. The running stitch, which you can see illustrated here, is an up-down stitch where you go up and then back down, making this shape. It looks like a dotted line when you go across the paper. A back stitch is the exact same thing. It's up, down, but then we reverse and we fill in the blank spots of the stitches. On the paper or on your fabric, it looks like a solid line when it's done. And the last piece to this is a wrap stitch. You're gonna do that around the edge of the paper here. It's not up, down, it's always up or down. It doesn't matter, but it's always the same. So you're wrapping around the edge of the paper. And truly, the last thing, I want you to try the idea of applique, which is to take something, a piece of fabric, so you're gonna cut out this circle, and you're gonna sew it into the space here. I think of the word applique like you're applying the piece of fabric to another piece of fabric. And again, it has to be small stitches, why I've given you these little dots here to remind you to keep your stitches small. First step, needles should always be kept in a safe place. So on a piece of felt fabric, push pin, cushion, whatever, never just leave them on the table, they roll away. Some kids struggle to thread their needle. A real seamstress often licks her thread and pushes it through the eye of the needle, but if you're struggling with that, sometimes your sometimes your tip of the thread has gotten frayed, and it helps to trim it with a little fresh end so that it slides through the eye of the needle easier. If you're still struggling with it, another trick I've learned, to fold a loop into your thread, hold it so it's a really small loop, and that sometimes is easier for students to push through the eye of the needle. My last trick for you is to cut a tiny piece of paper. I'm gonna cut a little bitty rectangle off of this. There's my little bitty rectangle. Let me move this paper aside so you can see. I'm gonna fold it in half the long way. You're basically making a little cradle for your thread. Nice crisp fold. Then you take this little piece of paper and you're going to lay your thread in it. So fold the piece of paper around your thread. This is now stiff so that it will push through the eye of the needle. So holding my thread inside that, sometimes that makes it easier for my students to get the thread to go through the needle. And then you just drop that piece of paper, you're done with it. To begin, I tell students you start from the back. So let's a hole with our needle. Not like that, I just totally ripped it. Then we're gonna push up. Why do I start from the back? Because now the tail of my thread is on the back side. That's where you want tails and knots and all that stuff to be, is on the back side of fabric. And then you're just gonna go along going up, down, up, down. So I just went up, now I need to push down. I think one thing that could be helpful on this project is to punch the holes in the paper first. Paper tends to tear, fabric does not tear. Whenever your thread is bunching up like this, the worst thing you can do is pull harder because you're just gonna tighten that knot that you've created. So gently sort of uncoil. It's usually just become twisted, but that twist can quickly turn into a knot when you pull. Another tip I have for students, never have more thread than the length of your arm. It's very easy to knot thread when you're pulling through piles and piles and piles of thread. You want it to be just long enough for your arm to extend and pull that thread taut and then move back to another stitch. I've just completed this row of stitching. Notice how it looks like a dashed line. There's spaces between my stitches. Notice how small my stitches are. They should never be bigger than that when you're sewing on a real project. On the back side, I'm just going to trim off my thread. It's actually pretty rare to ever need to sew a knot. If you leave your tails on the back side of your fabric where they're not going to show, this many stitches means it's really hard to pull this back out. So it's pretty secure just on its own. For the next one, the back stitch, you're going to start exactly the same, only then I'm going to sew back. To fill in all the gaps that you see on the running stitch, I'm going to put a stitch in between them so it looks like a solid line when it's done. At this point, what I have is my running stitch. I'm going to go back and sew in between each gap as I create new stitches. I just finished my back stitch. Notice how it's looking like a solid line. In sewing, this can be used to create a solid line if you are creating a picture. For example, let's say I was trying to sew something that looked like a smiley face. I don't want the smiley face to be a dotted line, I want it to be a solid line. So I would create something using the back stitch. Whenever I'm sewing, I manage my tail. I've seen students tie off onto the needle because they don't want it to fall off. But when I have a really long thread, I keep the tail long so I can manage the thread as I'm pulling it through. As my thread gets short like it is right now, I'm going to shorten my tail so that I have more thread to work with. When I'm sewing, I pinch it. I never just hold the needle here, I'm always holding it over the eye of the needle, so I'm holding that thread in place so it can't pull out. Keep that in mind as you sew. You can tie a knot on your needle, but then you've got to untie it at some point, which is kind of annoying. For the wrap stitch, I just pushed my needle up, and then I'm going to go around the fabric and I'm going to push my needle up again. Notice how it wrapped around the edge of the fabric. And this is what the wrap stitch looks like. It's also known as a whip stitch, as in you're whipping around the edge of the fabric. Now we're going to move on to applique, where I'm going to take this piece of fabric and sew it into the space here. I've given you the stitch holes again because I want to remind you to keep your stitches small. Both the running stitch and the whip stitch or wrap stitch can be used for applique. It's your choice on how you want it to look on the fabric. Whip stitch is also great for binding two pieces of fabric together, as is the running stitch. You could use either in either circumstance. About halfway through my applique process, I switched. Here I'm doing the running stitch, and then I switched to the whip stitch or wrap stitch where I was only going around in a circle, so only pushing my needle up. I just wanted to show you that either way will work.